Welcome back to the Holiday Lectures on Science, the 2005 Holiday Lectures. We've been covering the topic of evolution, and we're having a discussion session this afternoon on the topic of reconciling religious beliefs with the evidence for evolution. And you should all be familiar with our speakers from the series, David Kingsley of Stanford University and Sean Carroll of University of Wisconsin. They'll be joining us for this discussion this afternoon as well. But I wanted to introduce a couple of special guest discussants that have agreed to join us. And they're going to, each of them will give a brief introduction to the topic to just give you some orientation towards some of the thinking and the ideas that are out there. First, I'd like to introduce Father James Wiseman. Father Wiseman is a Catholic monk of the Order of St. Benedict, and he's also Associate Professor of Theology at Catholic University right here in Washington, D.C. He's actually the former abbot of St. Anselm's Monastery in Washington, D.C., where I believe he still resides. And he's the former president of the Monastic Interreligious Dialogue, and he currently serves as editor of the MID Bulletin. And although Father Wiseman is a theologian who's particularly interested in reconciling modern science, his specialty is actually Christian spirituality. And I wanted to point out a book that he's written called Theology and Modern Science. So if you're interested in some of the ideas that we talk about today, this would be a good book to find in your local bookstore. Our other special guest is Dr. Michael Ruse. He's really become, even though not originally trained as a scientist, he's an authority on Darwinian evolution and evolutionary thought. He's Lucille Werkmeister Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Program in History and Philosophy of Science at Florida State University in Tallahassee. And he's taught, before moving to Florida, he taught for many years in Canada at the University of Guelph. He has many books to his credit, but I think a particularly relevant one for today's discussion is a book he recently authored called Can a Darwinian Be a Christian? So again, if anything said today really interests you, that these would be good books to follow up on to get some more detail. And of course, they both have lots of references in them. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask Father Wiseman to come to the podium and start us off with some introductory remarks, and then he'll hand things over to Dr. Ruse.
In addition to teaching at Catholic University, I also teach in a high school at the St. Anselm's Abbey School, and one of my students is here. I taught class there this morning and missed him, but now I know why he was absent from class and not really playing hooky. At any rate, when Dennis Liu asked me to make a little presentation here, he said one point I should address is whether a Christian can accept biological evolution. And the short answer to that is certainly. It might even be that some of you use in your courses a best-selling biology textbook by a believing Christian and a Catholic, Kenneth Miller. You might also have heard that the late Pope, John Paul II, gave a very important talk about maybe 7, 8 years ago, in which he pointed out that evolution is very much a well-established theory, not just an hypothesis, and that there is absolutely no reason, certainly why a member of my own denomination, a Catholic, could not accept that as a well-founded theory. But if that's the case, then you might ask, well, why is it then that a good many religious people, including quite a few Christians, do reject the theory? Well, there are lots of reasons, and there's no need to go into all of them. I think one common reason is some people accept the early chapters of the Bible, the book of Genesis, as very literal. In my opinion, that's simply misunderstanding what a scripture is. It's not a science textbook, but if you take it quite literally, you might assume that human beings have been around only for a few thousand years. And as I think you know, and I believe Dr. Carroll pointed it out, there are millions of Americans who truly believe that. Another difficulty, and I think a somewhat more sophisticated and challenging one, is that the whole element of randomness in evolutionary theory to some people seems incompatible, at least with the Christian notion of divine providence, that in some way God is not only the creator and maintainer, but also the goal of all creation and of the universe. But in my opinion, that difficulty, people who raise that difficulty, are simply confusing two kinds of causality. When classical theologians, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, speak of God as the primary cause, that's not at all on the same level as the kind of causes that scientists study, whether they be physicists or chemists or biologists. It's a mixing of theology and science in a way that I think is not valid. Now, it's true that some scientists claim that science is the only valid avenue to knowledge. But anyone who would claim that would be doing it not as scientist, but rather as a representative of something that sounds a bit similar, but it's called scientism. And that's simply altogether different from what I myself would hold as a believing Christian and someone who totally accepts evolutionary theory. Now, what makes arguments and issues in theology or philosophy somewhat difficult, and why it leads to heated exchanges, in my opinion, is that so much is based on fundamental assumptions. Some of you have probably heard of a well-known and highly respected physicist down at the University of Texas, Steven Weinberg. Some years ago, he wrote an often quoted sentence in which he said that the more we learn of the universe, the more pointless it seems. Well, for such a person, the universe is simply here, uncaused, totally unexplainable. There didn't even exist any potentiality for its existence. It's just a total, absolute mystery. For me, it philosophically makes more sense to say this potentiality that anything at all exists lies in the power of God. But I do realize that words like that would not convince someone who already has the fundamental basic assumption that everything is ultimately pointless or absurd anyway. For that reason, I would say issues like divine creation belong primarily in philosophy classes or theology classes, while the theory of evolution belongs primarily in biology classes. It's true that data from the natural sciences can have an influence on one's philosophical or theological or religious position. That was, for example, the case recently when a well-known British philosopher named Anthony Flew declared that his study of natural science after many, many years had led him from atheism to a religious position that's usually called deism. But I think it's important to notice that that change of mind on his part was brought about on the level of philosophy and not on that of science. Now, I've said very, very little and tried to cram it into 4 minutes, but after several more introductory presentations, if you have some questions, I'd be delighted to speak with you further.
Well, I accepted the invitation to come here, and then I was absolutely horrified, not so much at speaking to high school kids, but because I'm a philosopher, and I was told that I'd only got 4 minutes to talk. I can't even get to the main verb in a sentence in 4 minutes. So let me just make 2 or 3, as it were, PowerPoint points. The first is that I'm an ardent evolutionist. I'm an ardent Darwinian. I think that Darwinian theory is a terrific theory. It's an absolutely smashing theory. it really thrills me to hear the kind of talks that you've had this morning. It seems to me that this is really life and being a human and being an intellectual and everything right at the cutting edge. I'm an ardent Darwinian. Second, I was brought up as a Christian. I was brought up as a Quaker. But I'm no longer a Quaker. I'm no longer a Christian. I prefer to think of myself as an agnostic rather than an atheist, but I guess if you were to push me, I'm pretty atheistic on most things. So you know where I'm coming from. Having said that, I simply have to endorse what Father Wiseman said, is I can't for the life of me see why one can't be both an ardent Darwinian and whether one can be a non-believer like myself or a believer like Father Wiseman. It seems to me that these are two separate things. Obviously, one cannot be a fundamentalist, a biblical literalist. However, one of the things I'm sure will come out in discussion, this is certainly not traditional Christianity. If one goes back to the fathers of the church, particularly St. Augustine, 400 AD, St. Augustine was very clear that you don't have to read the Bible literally, and frankly, friends, often you should not. The Bible is not a work of science. It's as has been said many times, it tells us where we're going to rather than where we came from. So I do want to say that I see these as two separate issues. Having said that, I think that there are issues of considerable philosophical and historical interest. I don't think one can just simply, as it were, pack up now and go home. I think that there are some of the issues I think that one has to work with are issues like the problem of pain and evil and suffering. If natural selection is true, then an awful lot of animals are dying in a great deal of pain. Is this God's way? Did God allow it? Did God permit it? Did God not have any choice about this? There are all sorts of solutions, but I think that these are things with which one has to wrestle. Secondly, and Father Wiseman already has pinpointed this, if evolution is a random process, then what about humans? Are we, as Stephen Jay Gould used to say, just the effects of our lucky stars? If that meteor had not hit the Earth, 65 million years ago, would humans not be around? I think that there are answers, but I think that these are issues which need to be discussed. Third, if in fact evolution is true, does this mean, in Richard Dawkins' memorable phrase, we're all selfish genes? What about morality? Is morality something just for the weak members of society, and should the strong person, as it were, be the Nietzschean Superman, or woman in this day and age, and just go out and do what they want and ignore morality? I don't think so, but I think, again, these are issues which need discussing. And the final one that I'm going to leave you with is, why is this such a big debate in America? You can tell from my accent, I was born in England, I lived most of my life in Canada, and frankly, this science-religion debate in this sort of way is not an issue. I mean, in Canada, for instance, we have state-supported Catholic schools, and yet the whole question of biblical literalism is not a big issue. Why is it an issue in America? And I hope that some of these topics will come up in our discussion today.
Okay, so I think my outlook on this is shaped by certainly the working scientist perspective. And you can imagine that the pitch that this discussion of evolution has reached in our culture has been disconcerting to the scientific community. And it's certainly disconcerting in light of what we think is overwhelming evidence, fascinating evidence, inspiring, beautiful, majestic evidence in support of the evolutionary process. And so my comments, or at least the topics that I sort of feel I want to lob out to you a little bit, is the coverage of this issue in the media. Obviously, the media is the place where a lot of people get their information, the television and newspapers. And I would, I think I'm going to just probably kick off some questions or some comments from the audience by just asking, for example, how many of you have seen in a newspaper or on television the perspective given by Father Wiseman? How many of you think you should hear more from people like Father Wiseman? Okay, that confirms my first suspicion. This issue has been so polarized, in my opinion. It's been polarized by the representation of extremism on one part, religious extremism, religious fundamentalism, and on the other part by hapless scientists sitting there trying to compress 200 years of science into 6 minutes of sound bites. And it looks like in the sort of philosophy of the media to give equal time that two positions, pro-evolution and denial of evolution, are represented. But those two individuals, of course, don't represent the equal weight of evidence. That scientist would have tens of thousands of scientists sitting behind him or her, and that individual, while he may have a very large religious flock, any claims that the scientific community is in any doubt about the validity of evolutionary theory is a gross distortion of the reality. And I think the media has failed miserably in doing their own investigations to understand the strength of evidence and the weight, the force of thinking behind the evolutionary position. So I'm most concerned from your viewpoint because you are, especially your generation, is surrounded by 24-hour news channels. This is very different than the environment we grew up in, where it was a one-half-hour news broadcast on 2 or 3 channels an evening. A lot more people read newspapers 25 years ago than read them now. And so you get this constant barrage of presentation of controversy, of conflict, of polarized viewpoints, whether they're about this issue or whether they're about other political issues. And that I think that's resulted in a gross distortion that, in part, one of the reasons for the holiday lectures is to try to bring at least the grounding back to what the scientific evidence says. What does the scientific process tell us about the reality of evolution? So my general comments are going to be, or my questions I'm going to try to lob out, have to do with the way you've been presented issues, the way you've been presented the balance or imbalance between issues, and some of your perceptions about what people think. So the first question I want to put to you, again, I don't mean to pick on Father Wiseman, not at all. In fact, maybe should I explain a little bit about my background? I went to a Catholic high school. I learned evolution from an ordained priest. I best understand the Roman Catholic position because that was the environment I was brought up in. So I'm taking advantage of that, a little bit of that understanding to say, how many of you that belong to different denominations than Roman Catholic, raised in a different denomination, find what Father Wiseman said surprising? And would any of you care to share why you find it surprising? Right there on the bench, yeah.
I think it's surprising because from the way I was brought up, I think I was taught to take the Bible a lot more literally, maybe not verbatim, but a lot more literally than what Father Wiseman was saying.
Sure, right here.
Ask you what you think is the main reason that there's so many Americans that have an issue with evolution. Do you think it's fear or our start as a Puritan group of colonies, or what is it, something else?
I think you wanted that one, didn't you?
Well, yes. I think look, I'm an evolutionist, and I think the answer to the present is in the past. And I would want to say it's obviously a major part, a function of your distinctive history. That this was a religious nation. It was founded by religious people who came to these shores either because they wanted to practice their own religion, or more particularly, they didn't want to be the victims of other people's religion and these sorts of things. I think that after the Revolution, particularly, Americans were looking for guidance. How do you live your life? And they no longer had the mores, the traditions of the old world to support them. And so at this point in the 19th century, if you like, the preachers, the Billy Grahams of the day, moved in. And the Bible became very much a basis for daily living, much more, I think, much more so even than the 18th or the 17th centuries. Now, complicating this fact is the Civil War, and particularly after the Civil War, in the South and as one moved west, the Bible became more and more almost what shall I call it, a kind of a cultural thing as well as a religious thing, because the Bible was, I mean, one of the things the Bible tells us is that God often afflicts those that he loves most. And people read it this way. People in the South and elsewhere said, you know, terrible things are happening to us, but that's okay. It doesn't mean to say that God's abandoned us. It means perhaps he expects us to labor on in these ways. And so, to a great extent, I see the Bible and literalism as bound up culturally. And I think it's true today. I honestly don't think that the intelligent design people or the literalists are lying awake worrying about spots on butterflies' wings. I truly don't think that they're lying awake saying, oh my God, toolbox genes, it's going to blast our theology all to hell.
And I'd like to respond to whether people should be scared of people like Sean and I. I think not. I think that, again, Sean said you can choose to ignore facts or not, but the facts continue to exist. And I'd like to point out that it's not that the facts are all scary, right? I mean, the facts of evolution and the way evolution works really is critical to everybody, including all sorts of medical issues as well. So the same people who may be afraid to hear about how genes work, I think will be very glad to know when they're being treated with antibiotics for an infection, or when they might unfortunately get a tumor, and the tumor is trying to evolve to spread throughout the body. Those sorts of genetic events that geneticists study, like geneticists at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, like our colleagues, this understanding of how mutations occur in cells and organisms, change them, allow them to have competitive advantages for infections to spread, for tumors to spread. This is the same kind of understanding that's absolutely critical to the treatments that are going to apply to most of the people in the world, including the people who may be afraid of the information that's coming from genetics.
I'm going to add one more. We're going to get back to your question. But I find it beyond ironic that juries condemn people to death or free convicted prisoners on DNA evidence whose the theory underpinning that very test is a central piece of evolutionary theory about genetic variation, about mutation, about the statistics of random events, etc. And so society right now depends on DNA evidence for questions of life and death. Yet the DNA record of natural history and evolution, we're not willing to contemplate it? Unimaginable. How can we have that happen?
My name is Juliet. I just have two questions. The first one's really short. For the two scientists, do you two believe in God? And secondly, how do you reconcile your belief in God with what you do in science? And do they work together? And like, have you seen that they work together, or are they like polar opposites?
Your call.
I don't see a fundamental conflict between religion and evolution. I think, I tried to say this morning, I think evolution is a description of how life changes. It's different than addressing where the whole universe came from, why there's something instead of nothing. Darwin says nothing about why the universe exists at all. And I think that there's still a place, and a critically important place, the why question of how the whole universe came to be, that isn't addressed by evolutionary theory. It's a false conflict to say that believing in evolution means that you have to believe that the universe came from nothing. I don't see the conflict, and it's baffling to me that so many people do.
So my personal concern really centers around, as I said before, the denial of evolution. I won't actually in public discuss what my religious views are. It's a decision I made a long time ago, because I think some people have made this comment before. There was a time when you didn't discuss who you voted for, how much money you made, and what church you went to. And the divisiveness that I think exists in our culture today has come from the breakdown of some of that, I think, good common sense politeness. So I'm not going to answer that direct part of the question. But I want to make clear, I think from the scientific point of view, just echoing what David said, the scientific community's stake in this discussion is all about the denial of evolution and the disregarding the scientific process. We have to understand that our standard of living, David's talking about medicine, hygiene, etc., the technology we have. These are the dividends paid by a scientifically literate culture, or at least a partially literate culture. I think it's very dangerous for us to say there's an entire body of knowledge that is inconvenient or offensive to us, and we're going to ignore that. What you believe beyond the realm of science, and I think scientists have to be very honest about where those boundaries are, what you believe beyond that is really part of the freedom we have as individuals, and especially the freedom we have in this country. So I think when scientists feel that their body of knowledge has been disregarded and infringed by the sense that it's going to be rejected out of hand by particular groups, that's what we're reacting against. And we, like other individual citizens, would like to have complete religious freedom outside of that. Hand right there? Yep.
I was just wondering, Father Wiseman, if you could clarify the distinction between creationism and intelligent design, if they are, in fact, the same thing or two different ideas?
Okay, the creationism and intelligent design, are they exactly the same? I would, Dr. Ruse probably would have a fuller answer, but in my opinion, creationism is the larger umbrella term. There are, for example, young earth creationists who believe that the world has only been around for 10,000 years or so, and there are other creationists who would accept a much longer geological era, but nevertheless be anti-Darwinian. Now, the intelligent design people, as I understand the history of it, and I've not gone into it in great detail, were originally quite willing to speak in religious language and to say even that this intelligent designer is God. When I believe myself that when they found that was running into legal pitfalls in terms of separation of church and state, they began to speak much more generally, just in sort of neuroscientific terms, not indicating who or what they thought this intelligent designer might be, but sort of leaving it up to your own ingenuity or imagination. But I think, in fact, it is intended to be, in their own minds, a kind of a religious position. I do believe that. Could you add to that, maybe,
well,
or even disagree?
I think that this is absolutely right. But the question is intelligent design a form of creationism? And the answer is no, if you're insisting that it always be 6,000 years, 6 days, because certainly somebody like Michael Behe, a leading intelligent designer, he's quite open, he doesn't believe that. But this goes back to the point I made in my last answer. I think that intelligent design does properly fall under the creationist umbrella, if you like, inasmuch as these are manifestations of a deep worry about modernism, about the sorts of stuff that people feel very threatened by, even nice-looking guys like this. I mean, look at them. They're not even wearing ties, and they're up on the podium. Well, I'm a philosopher, for God's sake. I don't count. But I mean, the point is, they find people like this deeply threatening. And I mean, particularly somebody who works on genes. You've heard that next year it's going to be stem cell. Well, what sort of implications does this sort of work have for humans and human nature, and where are we all going to end up? And as I say, I see many Americans deeply, deeply threatened and frightened by the kind of work that these people, not so much that they do, but that they represent.
Let me just add, lest there be any confusion about terminology here, this might be unnecessary. Creationist is very different from simply accepting God as creator. I mean, creationist is a specific term that refers to people who are anti-evolutionist or anti-Darwinian evolution. One can totally believe in God as the primary cause, the maintainer, the goal of all creation, as the creator, and yet not be a creationist in that more narrow sense. Those are two very different things.
I want to add one point myself about the intelligent design. If you look under the hood of the origin of that movement, it was explicitly anti-evolutionary. And they have occasionally stepped into the water of making arguments with scientific content No transitional fossils was an argument made at one point. The fact that that's been demolished, actually it was dead on arrival. There had been plenty of transitional fossils found prior to the articulation of that argument. The fact that the scientific community has responded by saying this is an incorrect argument flies completely past them. They are not engaged in the process of refining and changing their thinking based on evidence. They have simply made assertions, and they continue, as I think Dr. Kingsley pointed out today, they continue to repeat these assertions in light of the evidence. There's transitional fossils all over the place. They've also occasionally put their toes in the water of genetics, and they've articulated positions that are absolutely inconsistent with what we know about a century of genetics. Doesn't matter about the bigger evolutionary picture. Their genetic arguments simply don't work. They're stillborn. And so they're trying to wrap some kind of scientific credibility around this notion, but whenever they put scientific content into their argument or their literature, it's been an utter failure. And when those critiques have appeared from the scientific community pointing out all of their errors, they are deaf to them. And that's why, speaking of my own opinion, but I think it represents a fair number of scientists, they have no credibility in the scientific community. They are not engaged in the same process that we are of putting ideas forth, having them shot to pieces, and rebuilding them from those fragments. They are just deaf, dumb, and blind when it comes to engagement with the scientific community.
The point is, it's not a question that they're bad scientists, it's that they're non-scientists. This is, I think, is a very important issue, because it's not that these are scientists who are not doing good scientific work. These are people who are not doing science.
That's it.
Do you think that in our lifetime we will witness a jump in evolution, either in humans or in some type of creature? And if so, how do you think the religious world will react to that?
That's for you guys.
Is that us? Do you want me to do this one first? Okay. So I'm going to take that. That's a nice open question. A jump in evolution. Remember, evolution is not necessarily progressive. So you are witnessing a jump in evolution. You're witnessing a major extinction underway right now. That's what I wanted to comment on at the end. And so what you're likely to see in another century is a lot less than what was here this century, and a lot less than what was here 100 and 200 years ago. And certainly, unless we manage things better, I mean, this is not, some radical environmentalism. The facts are there that populations and ecosystems are under such damage. Now, you're probably saying, are we going to see some kind of easily observable evolution in some population? Would that change people's thinking? Remember, evolution takes a while, and so to see it, you either have to look at viruses and microbes if you want to see it on the order of days or weeks, or maybe you can look at some populations of mammals and birds on the order of decades, and maybe some other things on the order of centuries, and see things that are very obvious. There's plenty of examples of measurement of change in populations on that scale. We didn't emphasize too many of those. If we had done some section today about microbial evolution, you'd see natural selection at work in microbial populations, and everything we've talked about playing out on the level of single-cell organisms. That information generally tends to be discounted by the evolution denial crowd as microevolution, and therefore they're not willing to extrapolate what you can observe in days in microbes to the building of an eye or something like that. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. I think you're saying, could there be something that's somewhat shattering or somewhat revolutionary in theology? I think the mind-blowing discovery of this century, or who knows when, would be the discovery of life somewhere else in the universe, and the study of what the basis of that life might be. How many times did life evolve? How did it get around the universe? What's the complexity of that life? What's the differences in chemistry? I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have any pet theories about what that would be, but I think a lot of scientists expect that it will be found. And that might be yet another huge leap in terms of humans confronting that we're not the center of the solar system, we're not the center of the universe, we're not the apex species, we're just another schmuck riding along on the surface of the planet.
I got something.
I'm quitting. Dr. Kingsley he's going to be moderator from now. You're going to take over.
I'll call him. Yeah, how about you?
Recently, in some public school systems, the proposal has been made that students should be told by their teachers or maybe by their textbooks that evolution is only a theory and not a fact, and other theories on this subject exist. Personally, I feel that this is wrong and that this should not be put into practice, but how do you feel? Is this appropriate or not?
I think it's completely inappropriate. It's denying the fact of evolution. The idea that we decide at the ballot box to stick a sticker on a book that says, don't believe this because we wish it wasn't true, is absolutely ridiculous. You know, we've tried to show you the overwhelming sets of evidence from all sorts of different fields that support that biological evolution occurs. It's a fact. It isn't a theory. There's no other theory that explains that body of evidence with anywhere near, not even close, the level of support that comes from this theory, which is why scientists believe it. Now, for lots of people, it's uncomfortable. That is not a reason to stick a sticker on a science book and say we wish it was different.
Sure. I'd only add, and you're probably all aware of this, the people that want something like that written are using theory in a very different sense from the way scientists use the word theory. Just a theory. Well, science in principle would never say that it has the absolute, final, ultimate, unimpeachable answer to anything. It's always, in principle, falsifiable. But in terms of being well-grounded, David's totally correct. You'll never get something better founded, I think, than this.
I'm going to take a quick shot because the one thing that's also missed, again, in the current media, I have not seen them have constitutional scholars, either in print or on news programs at night, to talk about the long legacy of this battle in the U.S. federal court system. You may know there's court cases pending right now at the federal level regarding making that disclaimer at the beginning of classes regarding intelligent design. There's going to be a decision handed down either this month or next month. But there's a long history of case law where stickers were banned. This is in February out of Georgia, where the teaching of so-called creation science, which was an incarnation before this, there's a long stretch of case law that I'm hoping is going to be upheld. Of course, we have some concerns about changes in the judiciary these days, but there's a tremendous amount of case law that supports that anything with religious content cannot be introduced in the public schools because of the Establishment Clause of the Constitution. So this is not just a scientific matter, it's a legal matter. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah.
There's many theories as the theory of evolution, whereas in physics there's many laws which are just accepted as true.
Inviolate laws versus theory. Maybe making a distinction between law and theory?
Yeah. What is that distinction?
I'm not sure I know the best way to answer that. Would any of you?
Well, I first of all, I would draw a distinction, say, between pure ideas like mathematics and logic, where these are not empirical claims, and I think their necessity, if you like, lies elsewhere. I'm not quite sure where it does, but I don't see 2 + 2 = 4 as just a generalization from experience. So I don't think that's going to be overthrown, although, of course, as we've seen, one might say have an alternative geometry or something like that. The question then is whether it applies to any world-like systems. Now, as far as scientific claims are concerned, I suspect you're probably right. I cannot ever see us going back to saying the Earth is the center of the universe. And frankly, I pretty much got to the point, I can't ever see us going back to evolution didn't occur. Having said that, an awful lot is still up for grabs, as obviously the revolution at the beginning of the last century over Newton versus Einstein clearly shows. I mean, 150 years ago, everybody would have said that Newton's, as they did say, as certain as 2 + 2 = 4. And then, whoops, apparently not. Now, I'm not going to say that we're going to overthrow natural selection as such, but I would say that people like Sean Carroll, in the last 20 years, have shown us that natural selection doesn't necessarily work in the way that people thought, say, 50 years ago, say in 1959, at the time of the anniversary of the origin of species, the 100th anniversary. So the point is, science is both stable, but at the same time, always open to, if you like, check, refinement, and significant change. I mean, I think that Darwin, I think there's no person in this world, if I can put it this way, whom Darwin wouldn't like to have an evening with more than with Sean Carroll. I think he would absolutely love it, and would not go away saying, oh my God, dig me out of Westminster Abbey, I don't really deserve to be there. I think he would say, way to go, way to go, way to go. So I don't see the fact that science is constantly changing as being something which is necessarily threatening. It's really rather like evolution. It's an ongoing process.
I'll throw something out there. It is along that vein. You know, that last part I told you about the history of hominids, you would have read something, you would have seen something completely different 20 years ago, and I predict you will see something. When I say different, it doesn't mean throw it all out. It means reshaped, rethought, reconfigured the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
We're already on that. I mean, this little hobbit, you know, Homo floresiensis, which has been discovered in Indonesia, it's not making people say, oh my gosh, evolution is not true. It's not making people say, oh my gosh, Lucy is irrelevant, but it's saying, oh my gosh, it looks like, you know, hominid evolution was a lot more fuller and more exciting than we ever thought before.
So I'd like to, I'm sorry, I just got to jump in for a second, because I want to make sure that everyone is hearing the distinction between refinement and whether we expect that complete ideas are going to be thrown out. So Einstein refined Newton. That didn't change the fact that Newton's predictions about the way gravity works and the scale that he talked about for the macroscopic sorts of objects was wrong. It was refined. We still have a law of gravity. I expect you're absolutely right that our understanding of the details of how evolution has worked and whether large mutations or small mutations, whether things can jump or whether it's very gradual, these issues of rate and whether there's drift as well as natural selection, all of that's true, and it's very vigorously worked on by scientists all around the world. There is constant improvement and refinement. But I don't want people to take away from that the conclusion that I sometimes see in the sensationalistic media reports about evolution and religion that, the scientists are debating this, so maybe it will go away. Maybe the fact of biological evolution, if we just wait a little bit longer, it's gonna go away. The fact is, we're refining the mechanisms by which evolution works, but scientists consider the body of evidence that supports the fact of evolution as absolutely overwhelming. And there isn't a doubt that a new discovery is going to be made that is going to make us believe tomorrow, oh, evolution didn't work, it didn't occur. And I think that's important because I think that that's a misconception that often comes when you hear that new things may be discovered or that new human fossils will make us think differently about human evolution. It's true that new human fossils are going to fill in details of human evolution. It's not going to change the fact that humans have evolved by modification from descent from other organisms that were already here, just as all the other organisms that are connected in a big tree of life.
If evolution and creation were to be, to kind of work together, I just don't see how that could be because in the Bible, there is no mention at all of any dinosaurs or anything like that. And, if that's really the way it went down, then how come there's all these fossils that support that? Wouldn't there be some documentation of that if God made it that way?
The Bible does not intend, nor should we expect it to give a total history of everything that's been going on in the world since its very beginning. Honestly, I have never even asked myself the question why there wouldn't be something like dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible, because that was simply alien from the purpose of the human authors of the Scripture. It was not important enough to even include that kind of material, even if it was known about. I rather doubt that the people who wrote the Scriptures were even aware that there was a time when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And there's simply, in my opinion, no reason why something like that should be included in a religious scripture.
But the only way I'm saying that, the only way that could have happened, that evolution could have gone, or that creation could have gone, that the two could have happened, simultaneously or something, would be that if humans and dinosaurs were around at the same time, and we know that's not true.
I wonder if I could just sort of put in 2 cents worth here. Can we, say, take a particular scriptural event and look at it in the ways that I think are wrong and the ways that I think are right? Let's take Noah's flood. Noah's flood is very, very important for today's biblical literalists. It's funny that the flood seems to be more important than Abraham and Isaac, the Tower of Babel, or any of these things, because they want to see the flood as both a geological event and also something which mirrors Armageddon, which is coming. So the universality of the flood is very important. I would say, and I suspect, but I'll let him speak for himself, but I would want to say the flood just isn't about geology, it's not about shipbuilding, and it's certainly not about how you get rid of all that poo when you've got all those elephants on board, for 40 days. I mean, it really isn't in, sanitation engineering. I would say at least part of the story of Noah, as you remember, after they come to land, and then Noah's found drunk in his tent, I would want to say at least part of that story is that simplistic, universal solutions, let's just wipe everything out and start again and it'll all be cleaned up and everything like that. I think one of the things that those authors are trying to tell us is life's more complicated than that, and trying just to go in gangbusters and wipe it all out and start again and that everything then will be just fine often isn't the grown-up way to do things. Now, I'm not saying that's the only story. I'm not saying that's necessarily the story that Father Wiseman would want to pick on first, but I think that is at least a story, and it seems to me that that's a very important and very true story. So that's the sense in which I would want to read the Bible as being true and important, not about geology, but about human beings.
Sure, I agree.
Go ahead.
I have a question that might be a little bit off topic here, but I was raised a Catholic. I went to a Catholic school until I moved, until I was about 10 years old. And if I remember properly, Christians believe that humans are made by God in God's image perfectly and basically as we are meant to be. How do you reconcile that belief with the theory of evolution, which insists that we are constantly changing and evolving?
Well, first of all, I would say I personally do not think that to say humans are created in the image and likeness of God limits that statement to human beings. I think that, I do believe that God is the creator, the maintainer, and the goal of everything that exists. But I believe that anything that exists on Earth or anywhere in the universe, simply by being in existence, is to some extent and to some degree an image of God. Now, you might say that human beings, to a certain extent, image that in a fuller way than a microorganism. But as soon as you hear, the book of Genesis say, human beings, let us make man and woman in our image and likeness, that doesn't rule out that other things, to some extent, also reflect the goodness, the beauty, the power of God. I think that would be my basic answer. Sure.
Let's go up here to the right.
So Catholics believe that we're endowed with souls and we have free will. How do you think that goes with evolution, that we have souls, that we have a special soul that no other animals have, and yet we also have free choice and free will?
Okay, here I might surprise you, but I honestly hope that some of you might actually get the book that I wrote. Seriously, because it's not incredibly complicated. And what I propose in there, and it's not mainstream, but I don't think it's unreasonable, is that there is a spiritual dimension, in my opinion, to every living thing. And I do not want to say that suddenly, for the first time ever, there was a soul or a spiritual element to human beings and never anything at all of the same sort in earlier forms of human life. I also myself do not believe that the human soul is an entity that is totally separate or separable from the body. I simply believe that human beings and all living creatures have a spiritual component or a spiritual element. And in other words, I emphasize much more kinship among all living things than I emphasize distinction. It's obvious that in many ways we're distinct from other forms of life. You know, you're never going to have other kinds of animal life sitting in an auditorium like this having a discussion of the sort we are. Nevertheless, I do believe that everything that is alive has a spiritual dimension, and that in some way it's not human beings alone that could be spoken of as, to some extent, spiritual.
I wonder if I could just put in my philosophical comment. Why not? By the way, buy my book too. You don't have to read it, just buy it. In fact, it's Christmas time, so if you want to buy a copy for your mum as well, that's fine by me. One of the things that one has to recognize in Christianity is that it's, to a great extent, it's an amalgam of Jewish thought and Greek thought. And people like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas were trying to bring these two together. And often it was very successful, but there are times where there are tensions. I don't mean that they can't be resolved, but there are tensions. And the soul is one particularly. The Greeks very much identified the body and the soul and the living thing as one, as it were, unit. And that's, for instance, why Paul talks about the resurrection of the body, because for a Greek thinker like Paul, it would be incompatible to have an afterlife without a body in some sense. Whereas people like St. Augustine were thinking much more in the Platonic way, where you separate out the body and the soul, and they're two completely distinct things. So, in fact, Father Wiseman, he may be sounding a little bit unorthodox, but in many respects, he's drawing, I think, on a very deep Christian tradition. I think he would probably agree it's not the only one, but it's not a question of, pays your money and you take your choice, but these are different options that Christians and others have to work with. Just as a scientist, when he's got a problem, is it going to be natural selection? Is he going to say, no, that this is a byproduct of natural selection? And I mean, it doesn't mean to say that one solution is necessarily better or that they're all equal, but it does mean that you've got a lot of things in your toolkit to work from. Right?
Let me slip something in here
Amen.
real fast.
Buy his books too.
No, not only do I not only respect Dr. Ruse's works, I've used one of his books in a graduate course I teach at Catholic U. I think, though, just now you unintentionally slightly misspoke on one point. I think when you were, just so the students would get confused, when you spoke of St. Paul being influenced, I think you meant to say by the Hebrew tradition.
Yes, I'm sorry.
You said Greek.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, I meant the Hebrew tradition. I mean, no. Whatever. Look, if you're a philosopher, facts don't count. It's just, it's like politics. It's just a question of, sounding wise and staying up aboard.
Sure, right here.
Joseph Campbell speaks of creation mythology as the science of the ancients. Would you consider the Bible a mythological and philosophical work which should be read as the epics of ancient cultures are today, or the epic of our own time? I know it's not exactly an epic.
I also teach at my own monastery's high school, and we're doing world religions. And we're just ready to enter the final part of the course, which is on the primal religions. Now, by primal religion, I refer to those that do not have their own written scriptures. For example, the Australian Aborigines or many of the North American Indians and so forth. But we do know something of their belief through anthropologists and other scientists who have gone and listened to these people orally recount their myths, their epics, if you will. And what I find so interesting, and Jeff and I are going to see this in class next week, if you look at some of the myths, say of the Maori people of New Zealand or the Dayak tribes of Borneo, they're dealing with the same kinds of questions that you find in the Bible or in the Quran or in some of the scriptures of the historical religions. The basic religious questions throughout history, and there have probably been thousands of religions, have been, where does it all come from? Who am I? What does it mean to be a human being? How should I live? What comes after death? Those are the kinds of questions that the Bible answers in its own way, but not all that differently from what many of the other scriptures respond to. And those are the basic questions of human life. And so I think that, to me, that's what the Bible is.
Can I just add sort of a personal note? As you can imagine, having been brought up as a Quaker just after the Second World War, Quakers, of course, are pacifists. And I was taught, at least at one level, in a fairly literal way about the Bible, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, about turning the other cheek and these sorts of things. But as one, as it were, reads the Bible more and more, one starts to see that these things are a lot more complex than simply pulling passages out, even passages that Jesus said just like that and saying, this is the way that we've got to deal with life. I mean, for instance, at one point, Jesus says, leave your wife, leave your parents, turn your backs on everybody. Now, I don't call that a particularly moral sort of way. St. Paul says the very opposite. He says we've got obligations. So what I would want to say is that you read the Bible not for instant insights into this is what I should do because it says so in Galatians 3:14 or something along those lines, but that as one sees, let's say, Joseph and his brothers trying to work things out, or in that case, not working things out, and then forgiveness, and these sorts of things, I think that this is the way to read the Bible. Myth, but it's the way that you read great literature, whether it's Shakespeare, whether it's Dickens, whether it's Tolstoy, and you put these things together, not just like that, but as an overall package, very much, I think, as a scientist would. I mean, he finds some discovery and says, gosh, this is terrific. But then, as it were, the next day you come in and you realize, yes, but this is not going to, get him on the back of the 10-pound note like Charles Darwin is, but that it's going to be part of a bigger picture, and we're always trying to work on small things to give us the overall view.
My question is, how can we put those more together? Say if before we didn't call it evolution, or maybe we did call it evolution, but we brought in this was God's divine plan, and he made us change because of all this stuff. Would there be such a division between that?
I think you're still asking this question of accommodating both. Is that right? Of accommodating both. And I think what I was trying to say earlier, reason why I thought I understood Father Wiseman's position is I was taught evolution by ordained priests. For many denominations, for many decades in this country, there's been an accommodation. And I think it's a very interesting understanding to reach in terms of those individuals who hold both views, are very serious religious people, and fully accept the scientific position. Part of this exercise, I think, is to expose you and other people in the viewing audience to that line of thought, which I think has just not been put out there in the public in public forums. I'm going to just follow up because I have a whole bunch of quotes from religious leaders that maybe will just, if you were brought up hearing these words, you or your family or any of your families, you might be thinking something different. And this is from the Bishop of Oxford. This is from the Anglican Church. So this was a BBC Thought for the Day in 2002, and it was a reaction to a movement in one school in England to, pretty much reject the teaching of evolutionary theory. And what the Bishop of Oxford, Richard Harries, pointed out, he said, quote, "The theory of evolution, far from undermining faith, deepens it." This was quickly seen by Frederick Temple, later Archbishop of Canterbury, who said that God doesn't just make the world, he does something even more wonderful. He makes the world make itself. God has given creation a real independence, and the miraculous fact is that working in relation to this independent life, God has, as it were, woven creation from the bottom upwards, with matter giving rise to life, life giving rise to conscious, reflective existence in the likes of you and me. And then he goes on, and I'm not going to go over the rest of the quote about talking about the Bible, but he asks, do people really think that there's a worldwide scientific community is engaged in a massive conspiracy to hoodwink the rest of us? And so I think I've seen when members of the clergy and leaders of the clergy articulate a position that is seriously in support of the scientific knowledge, and at the same time are leading their flocks from a viewpoint of doctrine or theology. This, I think, really helps people deal with make this sort of accommodation. When you see the theater on CNN at night, I don't think that's helping anybody. I don't think it changes anybody's minds.
Maybe I think I've got pretty much your issue. Let me maybe add to what Sean said there, because I agree with everything he said. In terms of just compatibility with belief in God and evolution, couple statements. First of all, I deeply believe that truth is one, and that you can never have, and I believe that evolutionary theory is so well-founded that I accept it as true. Now, that, for me, a priori, that means that is not going to conflict with my belief in God. That also means, though, that I cannot understand God as some sort of puppeteer that just pulls all the strings and everything goes exactly in one particular way, and that there's no freedom or no choice or no randomness. The greatest Catholic theologian ever was St. Thomas Aquinas, who literally and explicitly said that there are many things in this world that occur by chance, and he did not see that as at all incompatible with his understanding of divine providence and God's overall guidance. I believe, and this is an image that some of you have probably heard before, that if somehow you understood the history of the universe is on a tape and you rewound it and then played it again, would it come out in exactly the same way? I don't think so. I think it was Michael who pointed out that, that 65 million years ago, if a meteor hadn't by chance hit the Earth, we might not be here today. But I do believe myself, and I can't prove it, but there are good scientists who hold it, that there seems to be enough in just the structure, the intelligible structure of the universe and what we call natural laws, that there is a certain drive towards the rise of intelligence. So whether Homo sapiens would have occurred again, I don't know, but I think there would have been intelligent life myself.
Can I just add one final thing here? One of the big issues that Christians always wrestle with is, what does it mean to say that God is eternal? And I think basically the position that many want to take is the same as perhaps not the greatest Catholic philosopher ever, or Catholic theologian ever, but the greatest Christian theologian ever, namely St. Augustine. And St. Augustine said his solution is that God is not in time. You shouldn't think of God as being very, very old and he's going to go on living forevermore. It's rather like God, where does a circle begin and end? God is eternal. Now that means you cannot think then of God one day waking up and saying, oh, I think I'll create the earth. Oh, I'll do it tomorrow. Boom. Oh my gosh, now what shall I do tomorrow, for a follow-up? God doesn't work that way. For God, the idea of creation, the act of creation, and the completion of creation are as one. And St. Augustine, he wasn't an evolutionist in our sense, said this means that at some level the potentiality is there and has always been there, and what is happening on earth is an unfolding of that potentiality. And certainly many Christian theologians like Jack Hort at Georgetown University would say, yes, the best Christian theology, in fact, if anything, demands a developmental picture. It doesn't necessarily follow that it would be Darwinism. That's for these people to do. It's not, the theologians aren't going to tell you how exactly the science works, but they would say that their theology, which comes from this very basic question about what does it mean to say God is eternal, means. So do recognize that there are major theological and philosophical reasons why evolution ought to be welcomed by believers.
Sure.
It's not just a question of, oh gosh, we've got to believe it, how can we do this?
I'm going to go to the upper deck here in turquoise.
Dr. Ruse mentioned briefly the issue of survival of the fittest and how that deals with issues of morality. Could you expand on that?
What's that?
Did you not hear the question?
Yeah, no, not really.
She said survival of the fittest. You touched upon it. I think you were talking about things like pain and suffering and things like that, and
right.
Morality.
Well, okay. Well, I'm not sure that pain and suffering are necessarily the same as morality, but I mean, first of all, don't forget that whether you're a Darwinian or not, you're going to have to face up to the issue of pain and suffering. Even if you say, I think everything was created yesterday, you've still got the problem of pain and suffering today. So this is not something which is specifically an evolutionist problem or something that evolution uniquely introduces into the what shall I say, the pot. Already Christians have many sort of, what shall we say, counter moves that they would make. I mean, the most famous, of course, is with respect to pain and suffering caused by humans, the whole question of free will. God gave us freedom. Unfortunately, freedom is going to lead to people doing bad things as well as good things, but God thought that, or realized that it was better that we have freedom despite the pain and suffering than that we just be marionettes controlled by the DNA and no more. So that whether or not you feel that that's an adequate answer overall, I think that it's certainly something that one can use, say, in the evolutionary context. Now, the traditional argument about pain and suffering in the physical world is due to the great philosopher Leibniz. And Leibniz said, to say that God is all-powerful is not to say that God can do the impossible. God may be all-powerful, but it does not mean that God can make 2 + 2 = 5. And the point is that if God, in fact, has created through law, then perhaps as a consequence, we're going to have pain and suffering. I mean, pain and suffering is, say, burning. If you sit on a hot stove or something, you're going to feel pain. But it's better to feel pain from sitting on a hot stove than to be sitting down and saying, my God, that smells good, what's for supper? You know, so as I say, I think those would be the kind of moves that one would make. Very interestingly, the arch evolutionary atheist Richard Dawkins argues, and I think that he makes a good point here, he says that in his opinion, the only way that evolution can work is through natural selection. So if in fact you give good arguments to say, as I've been trying to earlier, to say that God had to create in a developmental way, that this was, as it were, part of the package of what being God meant and what creation means, then maybe one would say that pain and suffering, as it were, are part of this package deal, and just as inevitably as 2 + 2 = 5. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that, you know, end of argument. But I am saying that there are ways that one can start in on an issue like this.
Sure, yeah. I totally agree with everything he says. I will only add very briefly, if you ponder it carefully, you could not possibly think of continuing new life without preceding death. And again, the best religious traditions in the world, and I think among others, Taoism, simply say life and death are always together. And if you could maybe expand that and say joy and suffering, or life and suffering are always together. And you simply accept them as part of the one integrated whole.
Panelists, any final words?
I want to say this, that you people are so lucky that I mean, you know, one worries sometimes that one's going to run out of problems. What creationists and intelligent design people don't realize is that good science, you start the day with one question and you end the day with 2 questions. And I really envy you people, because science and evolutionary theory is just so exciting at the moment, and there's so much good work to be done. Go to it.
And I would only add, though probably you're here because most of you are going to become scientists, don't overlook the possibility that being a philosopher and a theologian is also very exciting. And those are good professions also.
I guess I'd just like to echo something that Sean said at the beginning, which is one of my biggest frustrations as a scientist, is the way that this story is often reported. And I do think that journalists are trained to report a controversy. So get one person on each side of an issue, regardless of the amount of data on the two sides of the issue. Put a mic in front of each one of them and hope you can get a big fight going, because that'll produce a good story on the news. I appreciate all of you guys coming and actually listening for 2 whole days about lectures on evolution, because I don't think that there's that many opportunities for people really to see the breadth and the history and the amount of data that's come from a whole bunch of different fields. And I appreciate you guys sitting through a couple of 2 solid days of chances for scientists to talk about the overwhelming body of evidence from all different sorts of fields, physics as well as biology and paleontology, that supports this key idea about how life has evolved on Earth.
I don't think I can add anything but my thanks. What a great crowd, and I hope you guys, your dreams come true. And I hope some of you take science into all sorts of walks of life, whether they're theological or philosophical, I'm not sure. But I will say we need more scientists in the media, in government, in all sorts of areas, because that illiteracy is costing us a great deal. So I hope you can see there's more than one way to take interest in science or knowledge of science forward. And I hope we've at least lit a few fires that, or at least encouraged a few fires that are already burning in some of you.